Hey everybody, today I have flown out to Michigan to take a look at one of the most important vehicles GM has launched in decades, and that is the all-new Equinox EV. This is going to be one of the longest range and most affordable EVs available in America, with a base price that could get down to $27,500 while giving you 319 miles of electric range. So is it any good? Let's find out. Now about that price tag, this is going to be under $28,000, including the destination charge, but not including sales tax, as long as you qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit. But importantly, all versions of the Equinox are going to get that credit, and of course, it's now a point of sale credit, so you won't have to finance that extra $7,500, assuming that you qualify for it, of course. And that's really the biggest deal with the Equinox. We don't find the full tax credit on a lot of the competition. Like the gasoline Equinox, the EV version is a compact SUV in North America. So think of this as the electric alternative to a RAV4, a CR-V, or of course, the Equinox. And this is not replacing the gasoline Equinox. We are going to see a completely new gas Equinox soon, but this does not share anything with that gas model other than the name Equinox. It doesn't share any interior components, and none of the structure is shared as well. So this is a dedicated electric vehicle platform. And I think it's really obvious when you look around the vehicle, and especially on the inside, which we'll get to in a moment. It has a design that is a little bit Equinox and a little bit Chevy Blazer, I guess. We have a divorced headlight arrangement where we find this light strip running across the top and then these really small LED headlights in front. I like this look. I am not generally the biggest fan of the divorced headlight theme, but I appreciate the fact that these are pretty discreet as far as the design. There's not some sort of big blob going on up front. Well-integrated parking sensors here, and keep in mind that this is not the least expensive version. This model's around $44,000 as we're testing here before the federal tax credit. They have said that that less expensive model is going to take a few months before it's on sale, so at the moment you're looking at a little bit more money. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, Chevy is giving us two EVs that are similar in dimension on the outside, but a little bit different on the inside. This is 190.5 inches long. It's about 2 inches shorter than the Blazer, but it's not just designed to be a smaller EV. It's also designed, again, to be a less expensive EV. So we have differences like a manual opening charge door instead of the power charge door in the Blazer. And the bigger difference is going to be in interior room. This has about 4 inches less combined legroom than we find in the Blazer, but it's still awfully roomy. Now there's some unusual trade-offs when you're comparing Blazer to Equinox, so we're definitely going to be diving into that in this video. Versus the gasoline Equinox, you'll notice that the roofline is a little bit lower, and depending on the version that we're talking about, we have a little bit less ground clearance as well. 6.4 inches in this model, which is about 1 inch below the Blazer EV. The tire and wheel package is going to change depending on the trim and the options that you select. These are 19-inch wheels, which are going to give us a little bit of extra cushion versus a lot of EVs on the market. These are 245/55 R19s. Of course, if you want 21-inch wheels and low-profile tires, you can get that as well, and then the tires are going to be a little bit wider at 275 width. Taking a look over there at the door, I really appreciate the fact that we have this subtle nod to the electrification with the parallel teal bars there instead of the E in Equinox. Ultium might just be the most flexible automotive platform in the world. It spans a huge delta from something like this Equinox on up to the ultra-luxury Celestiq, the Hummer truck line, the Hummer SUVs, and of course the Silverado EV as well. It supports front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, front-wheel biased all-wheel drive, and rear-wheel biased all-wheel drive as well. And that's part of the differentiation between the Equinox and the Blazer. There's going to be a rear-wheel drive Blazer, there's going to be only a front-wheel drive or a front-wheel drive biased Equinox. And the front-wheel drive models are the ones that are going to be available first, and those are the only ones we were able to drive today, except for a little bit of time in one all-wheel drive model. This is going to start with a single motor here, 213 horsepower, 236 pound-feet of torque. That's going to get you 0 to 60 in around 8 seconds. They wanted this to be very similar to the average RAV4, CR-V, etc. If you want to add all-wheel drive, they add a motor to the rear that bumps power up to 288 horsepower, torque all the way up to 333 pound-feet, and it's going to get this 0 to 60 just under 6 seconds. Both models will use the same 85 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and you'll get up to 319 miles of range if you choose the front-wheel drive model. If you choose the all-wheel drive model, there is a decent range penalty. You'll be just under 290 miles of range. Charging, that is one of the areas where General Motors was really focusing on affordability for the vehicle and practicality as well. Most people charge their EVs at home, so this has a pretty fast AC charger, 11.5 kilowatts. Definitely faster than the chargers we find in the Toyota or the Subaru EVs. But the DC fast charge speeds, those are a little bit slower than some, especially for the battery size we have on board. 150 kilowatts peak in this vehicle. GM won't talk about 10% to 80% charge times, which is the industry norm spec. Instead, they're just going to say that this gets 77 miles of range in 10 minutes of DC fast charging, assuming, of course, you start right around 10% state of charge. So by all appearances, this does seem to charge a little bit slower than some of the competition. Although keep in mind, none of the competition has a starting price this low. A lot of folks ask, why is there no front trunk in the Ultium platform vehicles? Well, it's pretty obvious right here, because they put the charger, the inverters, the electronics for the front motor, etc., all under the hood, and we have a hood that is definitely shorter than, for instance, in a Model Y. This makes a lot of sense, because to add extra length to the front, you don't get quite as much cargo capacity as if you add those same inches back here to where the big hatch is, because we simply have a larger sectional profile. So if I had a choice, I would always take the EV with a shorter hood and a longer back end, because it simply means you're going to get more interior space. One more thing about this PowerPort before we move on. It's going to support the same vehicle-to-home infrastructure capability that we find in the Silverado EV, the Hummer EV, and actually the entire rest of the Ultium family. It's going to allow you to offboard up to 9.6 kilowatts of power to back up your home in the event of a power outage. And thanks to the 85 kilowatt-hour battery pack, that could run the average home in North America for a day to a day and a half, depending on exactly how much power you're using, of course. Now, on the downside, that backup ability is a little pricey, and I don't know if I would necessarily do it. It's going to be about $7,400 to purchase the equipment plus installation, and it's only going to work with the existing set of Ultium vehicles and perhaps a few future Ultium vehicles as well. But it's not going to work with a Ford EV or a Tesla, or necessarily General Motors' upcoming EVs that are going to have the native J3400 connector on them. We don't know too many details about exactly how that's going to work, but the big thing to know is that the vehicle is not doing the AC inversion. It's actually just offboarding DC power from the CCS pins right there, and then the inversion is happening offboard on the unit that's mounted to your garage wall, or wherever you end up putting it. But definitely an important thing to keep in mind. Moving around to the back, you'll notice a little bit more of a difference between this and the gasoline Equinox. We find not only a lower roofline, but also a bit more of a bell shape to the design. That's mainly due to aerodynamics. They really have to curve the body in here in order to help improve the aero profile. Logically, that does mean less cargo capacity behind the rear hatch, but I think it also leads to a more attractive design. We do get a rear wiper, which is something I know a lot of folks are interested in. A lot of EVs out there have deleted the rear wiper, and then some of those car companies have changed their mind and added the wiper back. There's a little bit of a tiered cake design going on here with the upper spoiler and then this sort of flat area in the hatch. Large LED lights back here, of course, with the Equinox logo, and then well-integrated parking sensors down below. There is a little bit too much black plastic back here for my tastes. It is kind of a shiny, sparkly black plastic, but I think that's going to show scratches a little bit more easily than maybe a matte plastic piece would, especially if you're the kind of person that maybe lives in an urban area where people might end up giving you a little bit of bumper rash here and there. Versus the gasoline Equinox, I am sitting a little bit lower in the Equinox EV, but I still have a really good view of the road. And thanks to a lot of headroom, I can put the driver's seat in a much more upright position than many of the EV competition and certainly get that more SUV-like driving position. Another thing I also appreciate is that this 2LT trim has 4-way adjustable driver's lumbar support, and even the top-end trims in a decent number of the competition only offer 2-way lumbar. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion and a nice thick rim, which is certainly my preference. Now, another thing to keep in mind though is that this front passenger seat in this model, which is about $45,000 or so, is not powered. It is just a manual design. The main reason to pay extra for the Blazer EV is going to be rear seat legroom, but as you can see, there is still a ton in the Equinox. This driver's seat is comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I still have quite a lot of room left back here, and certainly enough room to put some of those larger rear-facing child seats back here. In the middle seating position, reasonable amount of room is found, but you should know that the rear bench is narrower than the one in the Chevy Blazer, so another reason to look at one model over the other. We still have rear seat air vents and USB-C charge points. scooting all the way over. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. As you can see, I have less legroom, but still a quite generous amount back here. Also, lots of headroom. In this outboard seating position, I have maybe about 1.5 inches or 1 inch of headroom left or so, and the sides don't curve in quite as much as something like the Kia EV6. Now, the reason this is kind of surprising is because we do not find a big glass roof in here. And actually, glass roofs are a big reason why we find generous headroom in a lot of the competition, like a Tesla Model Y. The roof structure here between the headliner, the insulation, the backer board, and then the steel roof on top of it, that takes up a lot more room than just having a sheet of glass inside. And that's why we find glass roofs in so many EVs. It allows them to lower the roof line down, improve efficiency, and also give you a roomy cabin. On the downside, on a hot day like today, it's about 85 degrees outside, it gets really roasting hot inside. And this is certainly my preference, although I wouldn't mind a big panoramic moonroof that opened. Rear seat passengers get a fold down armrest with 2 cup holders and 60/40 folding rear seats that fold almost flat with the cargo area. Behind the power hatch, we find just over 26 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That is below average for a gasoline compact crossover in the US, but definitely healthy for an EV in this category, and actually 1 more cubic foot than you'll find in a Chevy Blazer. You might be wondering, how is that possible since the Blazer is bigger? Well, with the Blazer, Chevy really wanted to give us more rear seat room. So the rear seat back is further from the dashboard than it is in the Equinox, and it really feels cavernous inside. But the Blazer has another trick up its sleeve. The cargo area is actually a little bit wider than the one in the Equinox, and if you fold down the rear seats, you'll find notably more cargo room in the Blazer, of course. The main reason that you'll find more cargo room, however, in most of the gasoline competition is that this portion of the body is a little bit wider, and the cargo opening is going to be a little bit wider, and they're generally more upright with a taller roofline. So the box is basically just bigger. Again, we have those 60/40 folding seat backs, and the load floor has 2 different levels to it. It's in its highest mode right now. You'll see that we have a pretty deep storage well there. We can almost put a 22-inch roller bag in that little pocket. You can also store your EVSE or other things in that area. Then we have the tire inflator and can of Fix-A-Flat there. Or I can put this in its lower ride height mode there, and I get about 2 to 3 inches of extra height. And then we have a little bit of a ramp up to that rear seat back, since the rear seat back is a little bit higher off the ground than the cargo area. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in a 2LT trim, which is sort of a mid-level trim of the Equinox. Up here we have the buttons for the OnStar system and the forward-looking camera. That's part of the active safety system. Slide to the side sun visors, and no moonroof. You can get a moonroof in the Equinox EV, but apparently it's going to be a slightly late order option. Over here we have height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable headrests. And I have to admit that even though I kind of like an opening sunroof, I like the additional headroom that we find in this model a bit more. And in the Blazer EV, you're going to find sunroofs essentially in every trim. Moving over to the front seats, we find a fabric insert right there. That's that darker portion of the seat, and perforated center sections of that upholstery, even though these seats are not ventilated in this particular model. Moving over to the front doors, we find a reasonable number of hard plastics down there lower on the door, so pretty much the entire lower trim there, that's all hard plastic, around that bottle holder, etc. But we do have a soft touch armrest and a soft touch upper portion of the door. The rear doors, those are basically all hard, except for just the elbow rest section of that rear door, of course. I suspect not everybody is going to be a fan of the blue trim, but I have to say I really like the look in here. It reminds me a lot of the Chevy Trax, and that's actually a really good thing for me at least. I also like some of the details that we find if we look a little bit closer. So for instance, at that air vent right there, it has kind of a turbine style design with the blue accents on the inside of that air vent. We find 2 air vents of that round style, one on the driver and one on the front passenger side. So a little bit different than we find in the Blazer, where we also find those round air vents in the back. The blue trim continues across the dashboard right there under that big infotainment screen, and this big LCD is standard across the lineup. It's just over 17 inches, so it is really, really big. Unfortunately, it is missing Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. General Motors has run through a number of reasons why they don't have CarPlay in the Ultium family EVs, but the most logical one is the one they're not talking about, and that's that they want your driving data. You'll see that on this calculated route, it's already giving us a calculated battery state of charge on arrival, and that's because they have a lot of data. If everybody is navigating using the onboard connected system and you have internet connectivity in the vehicle, you're paying for that subscription, etc., they're going to have really accurate range estimates and charging estimates based on the destination destination chargers that you're using and the DC fast chargers that you're using, the route, the climate, etc. But if you were using CarPlay or Waze or whatever for your navigation, they wouldn't necessarily have access to that data, and you'd be less likely to subscribe to the data subscriptions that make the online Google connected services function. Now, whether or not that's good or bad to you, I will let you all decide, but that is the most logical reason. And that's also the most logical reason we don't find CarPlay and Android Auto in the average Tesla or Rivian, etc., etc., etc. They all want the data too. Although we don't have smartphone integration, I think that the rest of the software is pretty well designed, pretty intuitive and easy to move around in. We also have features like Amazon Alexa integration if you want to use that, Waze, even streaming audio, etc. in here as well. One thing that some folks have complained about, however, is that the light controls for the headlights, that's found over here in the infotainment system. Honestly, that doesn't bother me at all. We also have the controls for the one-pedal driving in here as well. Now below that screen we have two big air vents, the single zone automatic climate control in this particular trim, and a storage area where you can put your smartphone, but this model does not have a Qi wireless charging mat. We have two big USB connectors there, small storage area where you can put phones, knickknacks, things like that, two decently sized cup holders. The big difference between this on the inside and the Blazer is going to be that this is not as wide as the Blazer. So you notice the center console is certainly a little bit smaller, less storage space going on there, and the armrest is just not quite as wide. But under that center console, we still have a decent amount of storage area under there for small bags or things like that. Moving over to the driver's side of things, we have the same basic full-color LCD instrument cluster that we find in the Blazer. We get the same full-screen Google Mapping layout, as well as more of a safety-centric layout, a little bit more of a, I guess, more modern layout, clean look there. And then you can also get some dials if you want that particular look in the system as well. The shifter is the same column mount design we find in the rest of the Ultium family, and if we move out to the steering wheel, it's a nice chunky design with, of course, SuperCruise integrated into the top. That's why we see those little sort of demon eyes staring at us. That's part of the driver monitoring system, as is this little module on the center of the steering column. This is hands down the best hands-free driving assistance system in the world at the moment, and this is one of the least expensive ways you can get it. On the back of the steering wheel, we find this little baby regen paddle. We don't have adjustable regen in the way that we find in some of the other EVs that this competes with. Instead, this paddle engages almost full regen while you pull it down. You let it go and it goes back to whatever mode we had set in that infotainment system. Also on the back of the steering wheel, we have track up down and volume up down on the two sides of the steering wheel. Some other buttons over here for the media system, heated steering wheel button. This button interacts with that multifunction cluster. And then over here on this side, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control and the SuperCruise system. It's time to get the Equinox out on the road, and I will apologize because there are only two cameras on screen because we accidentally lost one of the camera mounts when we were at the Polestar event. At any rate, out here in Auburn Hills, Michigan, we were able to do some very preliminary 0 to 60 testing. This model came in right around 8.2 seconds. There was a little bit of an uphill climb there, so I'm going to go ahead and say that 8 seconds sounds rational once we can get this at home. Keep in mind that as with many front-wheel drive EVs, GM really dials power back until you hit about 31 or 32 miles an hour. That's pretty rational, and I'll show you why. Because if I were to just come to a stop here and floor it, we're not actually going to get to 32 very quickly, because otherwise you'd get a lot of torque steer, and they didn't want the front wheels to be peeling out and pulling you every which way. That's the big reason that we get better 0 to 60 performance in the all-wheel drive version. It's that they can simply ramp power up more rapidly. So you'll get more power sooner at lower speeds versus this front-wheel drive model. And that difference should be very noticeable because according to Chevy, it's going to be over 2 seconds faster 0 to 60. That's a big, big difference. Now, as far as the 60 to 0 stopping distance goes, I don't have any official estimates here because we haven't been able to do any testing. But I'm going to go ahead and guess this is probably going to be closer to 130 feet than a lot of the competition. Mainly because, as we see in other Ultium family vehicles, the Equinox is a little on the heavy side. You'll definitely notice that some of the competition is lighter. Part of that is due to the structure of the vehicle. The rest is due to the fact that we actually have a bigger battery in here than average. Yes, you'll find a big battery in the Mustang Mach-E, but this is definitely larger than the batteries that we find in a whole host of other competitors. It's about 85 kilowatt hours usable, likely over 90 kilowatt hours gross. Now in this area of Michigan, we haven't exactly had the usual winding mountain roads that we test on, so it's a little bit more difficult to talk about general driving dynamics, but it's just about as well sorted as any other front-wheel drive GM vehicle. It has a good solid feel to it, and I really appreciate the thick grip on the steering wheel. I know that's not everybody's preference, but I definitely prefer a larger diameter wheel. I think it's actually a little bit more comfortable. Bearing in mind that we are not driving this on our usual mountain road test route, handling seems to be pretty decent. Again, bear in mind the curb weight of the Equinox, but we do have relatively wide tires, especially those optional tires that are available on the Equinox. I haven't been able to spend much time in a model with those wider tires, but they should improve the handling and of course the braking scores as well. If you want something a bit more dynamic, you should really focus on curb weight. Of course, there are also those rear-wheel drive options in this segment. You know, rear-wheel drive versus front-wheel drive, there's a wide amount of debate on that topic. Yes, rear-wheel drive is going to be more fun, but if you live in a lot of America, especially the northern parts of America, you might really honestly want to get something like this over an ID4 or an EV6 or an Ioniq 5. Rear-wheel drive is an awful lot of fun, but as far as traction in snow, ice, winter weather, etc., front-wheel drive is going to be a bit more predictable. There's a reason that so much of the ICE competition is front-wheel drive, when manufacturers could very easily create some of those vehicles as rear-wheel drive vehicles. Yes, more fun, but traction and practicality definitely takes a bit of a hit. Of course, if you want the added traction of all-wheel drive, you can get the e-all-wheel drive setup in the Equinox, but it's always going to have a pretty strong front bias. The bigger electric motor is going to be up front. The rear electric motor is only going to be energized when you need the most power out of the system or to help improve traction. Most of the time, it's actually going to be basically idle. It's going to be disconnected electrically from the situation, and that's going to give you the best economy. Now, speaking of economy, over the last 1,000 miles, this vehicle has averaged a relatively impressive 3 miles per kilowatt hour. Bearing in mind that journalists have been driving this for over a week, back to back to back, 0 to 60 testing it, etc., it's actually a pretty decent score. And during the earlier portion of the day, we were solidly at almost 4 miles per kilowatt hour. That's how this is able to get over 300 miles of EPA range. Although I would remind you that the EPA cycle biases more towards city fuel economy, so obviously at higher highway speeds, expect your realistic range to be a little bit lower. Now, on that highway range figure, you should also know that if you want to road trip in your Equinox, it is going to take a little bit longer than some of the competition. If you wanted to say go 400 or 500 miles, and you started with a completely full battery, it'd be pretty easy to do the first 260 to 280 miles on the initial charge. But after that initial charge, you're going to need to stop the DC fast charge, and that DC fast charge session is going to take longer in this vehicle to recover, say, the next 200 miles of range than in something like an Ioniq 5 or an EV6. That's definitely going to be a big factor for some shoppers. For final cabin noise scores, you're going to have to wait until we can get one of these at home, but it appears to be pretty average as far as EVs go. And that's to say that this is definitely a little bit quieter, especially on rougher road surfaces or out on the highway, than the average gasoline vehicle. Not only do we not have the gasoline engine to worry about that could be creating noise, we also have more sound isolation between the road and the cabin, thanks to that big battery pack that's right there between us. And then, of course, we have a more aerodynamic design, and that generally tends to reduce wind noise, especially at higher speeds on the highway. So if you're looking for a quiet and comfortable ride, you definitely want to take a look at this. If you're looking for a solidly pragmatic EV, that's exactly what we find in the Equinox. And when you think about it that way, it makes a lot of sense that this shares the same name with the gasoline Equinox, because the same design philosophy and formula really informed both vehicles, not just in terms of styling, but in terms of their driving dynamic, the acceleration time, the cargo practicality, etc. There's nothing about the Equinox EV, aside from the missing CarPlay, that feels too new age or weird or awkward or will really take a lot of getting used to. All the controls are exactly where you expect them to be. The range is solid, the ride is comfortable, the ride is quiet, etc. There's no learning curve to hop into this versus the Equinox ICE, and that's exactly what they're looking for as far as mainstream acceptance. This is not targeted at someone that wants an overtly sporty vehicle or just wants a rocket ship on wheels, etc. This is targeted to the same customer that buys a regular Equinox that just maybe wants an electric one. Let's get down to brass tacks now. How much is the Equinox going to cost you? Well, if you want that under $30,000 model, you're gonna have to wait a bit because it's not gonna go on sale at the same time as the rest of the Equinox lineup. Instead, the Equinox is gonna start initially with the 2LT, 2RS, 3LT, and 3RS trims. The differences between the LT and the RS trims is entirely styling. There is no difference to the drivetrain, the suspension tuning, etc. You can get the same options on either one. It just depends on whether you want the sportier look of the RS or the more normative mainstream look of the LT. The 2LT, which is what we're driving right here, started at $43,295 plus $1,395 for the destination charge, plus $3,300 if you want all-wheel drive. Now bear in mind, all-wheel drive is going to hit your range figures from 319 miles down to 285. But I suspect I would choose the Equinox with all-wheel drive. I appreciate the fact that Chevy is going in a very efficient direction. Chevy uses a permanent magnet motor up front, and then they use a motor in the back with an electromagnetic stator. And that improves fuel economy because they can effectively disconnect the rear axle very simply. It's not quite as efficient as a mechanical axle disconnect, but it's a lot less expensive. And that's why we see perhaps a little bit more of a penalty for all-wheel drive when it comes to mileage. This particular model was around $45,000 or so, but bear in mind it qualifies for the full $7,500 tax credit. And because of some of the changes on the tax credit, more people are going to qualify for it. Not only does it happen at the point of sale, you no longer have to have a minimum tax liability in order to get it. However, you do have to meet the income qualifications. So if you make too much money, you're not going to get that. You're going to be paying $43,295 for the base model. If you want the RS trim, that steps up to $44,795. Keep in mind it's mostly styling that differs between those two models. And the 3LT model, which is the most expensive version at the moment, that's going to start at $45,295, with the RS trim being relatively similar in pricing. That's going to get you ventilated seats, 2-zone climate control, and some of the other luxury touches that you see in some of the other models out there. If you want SuperCruise, you can get that on the 2LT, the 2RS, the 3LT, etc. It's going to be $2,700, and that's also an option that I would select because SuperCruise is really novel in the electric vehicle segment, or the ICE vehicle segment for that matter, and it's going to be one of the least expensive ways to get SuperCruise in the United States. Bottom lining the Equinox EV is pretty simple at the moment because this is quite simply the least expensive way to get over 300 miles of range in North America at the moment, and it is significantly less expensive than most of the competition. The Mustang Mach-E does not qualify for the full federal tax credit. The Model Y does, but it is significantly more expensive, as is the related Honda Prologue. It's a lot more expensive than this. The Ioniq 5, the EV6, etc., they don't qualify for the tax credit, so they're going to be a lot more expensive than this as well. Again, bearing in mind that qualification for that tax credit is important. So for me at least, a lot of the downsides of the Equinox, the fact that we don't get Apple CarPlay, the fact that the DC fast charging is a little on the slow side, just don't matter at all because this is so much less expensive. In the end, my only real question for Chevy is, can you build enough Equinoxes? Because there have been some production problems with volume on the Ultium family, and that's why some of the Ultium vehicles have been a little bit hard to find in North America. Chevy assures us that they have worked through those problems, and their answer was they will build as many Equinoxes as customers want to buy. I'm not too sure about that just yet, but we will see how it goes because I suspect that demand for the Equinox, especially the less expensive trims, is going to go through the roof. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below, and what do you think about the Equinox? I think that Chevy did exactly the right thing with this model. I'll see all of you next week. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, X, social, things like news and post and blah, 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 and I'll see all of you next week.